Hello, welcome back to another online lesson for the Elizabeth course. This lesson, the problem of the poor, is quite complicated. So we'll probably do this a little bit slower just to try and get your head around all of the different features of this topic. It is a big topic and it is quite technical and a little bit tricky too. Lots of things intertwine with each other. So hopefully by watching the video you'll be able to pause or stop or go back and listen again to any bits that you haven't quite got your head around. But by the end of it, we should have hopefully a good understanding of the problems of the poor, what Elizabeth did about the poor, but also most importantly, why was there a rise in poverty and poor people. Okay, so it's interesting, an interesting topic, certainly lots relating to today in society. A couple of links perhaps similarly to some of the economic problems in the Nazi Germany course. But if we try and keep our head really focused on the causes of poverty first, and then the solutions, if there were indeed any solutions. So take your time with this one, make sure your notes are really well organised as we go. So remember to pause the video wherever you need to, just to get your head around what we've said, or go back. Okay, so before we start, let's consider some really important words that you'll see lots in this lesson. So a vagabond is a person who wanders from place to place without a home. Okay, poor relief is the idea of financial help. Today we might call that benefits, but back in Elizabeth period, they introduced some poor relief. Probably the first time really that there was a sort of, if you like, benefit system. Alms were also a charity that were given to poor people, and itinerants were people who had moved from their home or parish looking for work. So we're going to have a rise of vagabonds and itinerants, but sadly in this story, lots of these vagabonds were punished severely, even though, as we'll see as we go through the lesson, they found themselves in these horrible positions of poverty and homelessness through no fault of their own really, yet the punishments are really harsh. So let's get ourselves into the story, nice and slowly, remember, just to get our head around it and understand it. It would be a difficult exam question, I think. However, within this lesson, we'll look at a model answer if it was a 12 marker and talk about if it was a 16 marker. Okay, so let's get started. So who are the poor first of all? Let's get our head around a little bit. Who are the poor? Okay, so anybody who couldn't work would lead to poverty. That's very similar today, isn't it? That people who can't work or don't work for whatever reason, then they're poorer, aren't they? That's the point. If you work, you have a job, you have a wage, you can probably do more things like holidays and cars and things like that. But if you're really poor, it's harder to do those things. Poverty also, as we know today, leads us to starvation and illness. That's no different. The poorest in society are generally those who have the worst health. Illness also leads to desperation. If you've got to get medicine or you've got to get food or you've got to feed your kids or your family, we can do extreme things which can lead to people begging on the streets and things like that. And obviously crime as well can go up to in poverty. So as we go through this lesson, generally speaking, every example that we talk about will have a long-term or short-term pop-up. Can you try and make your notes, or anywhere how you do your notes, which I'll suggest in a sec, remember to put long-term or short-term causes. In other words, is the example that we're now talking about a cause of poverty really quickly because that happened led to this, or is it something that sort of led to poverty more over time? Okay, so we'll see them as we go, but just remember that's the gist of what we're going to try and do in the first half of this lesson. Why did poverty increase? So the main findings of a survey that they took place in Norwich, which is the second city at the time after London, that they did a little survey to try and find out what was going on in society. Elizabethan society is generally concerned for the poor, much more than in previous rulers, but still also not particularly kind to them as well. Maybe as the Elizabethan era comes to an end, a little bit better. So they want to do this little survey in Norwich and they want to find out how many itinerants there are, how many vagabonds there are. They're basically looking to just find out what's going on, who's getting poor relief, who might need to get poor relief. So quite a modern idea for a government to do, really. So the main things that they found in this little survey was that 40% of the poor that they counted in the survey was under 16. So nearly half of all those people in poverty was under 16. Now that goes without saying really. They're probably going to struggle to get work. They're going to be farming the lands. Think about that education lesson as well. So the poor people, their entire reason for being is to farm the land. They also found that families that had been headed by a woman were also the poorest. So if a woman had to work, they were paid less than men. Now we know that, we expect that, that doesn't change really right up until the 21st century. We're still fighting a little bit for some more equal pay in some cases, but generally speaking that would be because the husband has died or left and left the woman in charge. This survey also found, and this is a really shocking statistic really, and you want to know this if you can, get this into any exam question that you can, that a family was typically spending about 80% of its income on bread. That doesn't mean that they were buying loads and loads and loads of bread. That means that the cost of bread was 80% of their entire income, showing us, doesn't it, that with inflation, which we'll talk about in this lesson, that they could barely afford to buy bread. And if they did get bread, they couldn't afford to buy anything else. So there's some similarities there to hyperinflation in the Germany course, but we need to not make sure we don't confuse this Elizabeth course with hyperinflation. There was some really bad inflation that we'll talk about in this lesson, but not quite to the levels of hyperinflation. But still, with that statistic alone there, 80% of a family's income was spent on bread is really, really crazy. 66% of the people surveyed were women, so in poverty. And a quarter of those were over 60, so old ladies. Older ladies, again, probably their husbands have died or left them, and they find themselves destitute. You know, women in society, as we know, weren't particularly valued or favoured, especially when it comes to men. And most of these women have been abandoned or widowed, meaning that possibly finding another husband would be really difficult, especially as they're getting older. The purpose, remember, of a woman is probably to just have kids and be a dutiful wife. So the older they get, the harder that would be. Hence, in Norwich, particularly these massive, horrible findings. I think you can agree that this was a real difficult time. Now, Norwich being the second city, so London the biggest, and then Norwich in England at the time, that might surprise you. But it's a good snapshot of society, and it probably is similar elsewhere in smaller towns and cities as well. So we've now found this out. They've obviously commissioned this survey for a reason, the government. They obviously think they're going to do something about this, or at least try to understand why it's happening. So the best way for you to do your notes in this lesson, I think, for the first half at least, is to do like a mind map. So on the screen is an example how you might do it. So a little picture for low wages, land, inflation, sheep, farming, population growth, enclosure, harvest and food. And as we go through, you just add some bullet points to each of these images, or you can just write your notes however you want to, as long as they are essentially subtitled into these reasons. These are the reasons why poverty increased. So for a 12 marker or 16 marker, obviously it would be any three of these. All right, if it's a 12 marker, you have a free choice, why poverty increased. If it's a 16 marker, which you'll see later in this lesson, they'll give you one as the main reason and ask you if you agree, and you pick the other two yourself. Okay, so that's how I think this should be done, just to try and keep the technical information. There's a lot of information coming at you in this lesson, so if we can try and keep some pictures or some dual coding to go with it, will just help your notes. All right, so when you're ready, if you want to go and get that set up, draw those pictures or set up your subtitles and then unpause the video and we will carry on. Okay, so we're going to start with population growth. Now, as always, when we do these kinds of things, the notes that you're going to see on the screen will relate to a paragraph. So keep in mind that we are essentially now planning what we might say in a paragraph about why population impacted poverty. So we'll start with, obviously, if it was a 12 marker, one reason why poverty increased was due to the population growth. So let's get some information and some facts in our notes about population growth. So firstly, as we know from earlier on in the course, by the end of Elizabeth's reign, population has grown by about 35% in Elizabeth's time. About 1 million extra people in the country, so merchants, people from Europe, whatever it might be, this growing merchant class. Also, especially growing fast in the towns and the cities, so the urban areas. Now, as we know today, when we talk a lot about immigration problems and migrants and all those things that we're seeing in the news at the moment, more people in the country put pressure on the services. This is probably no different back in Elizabeth's day. So we'll see now how this population growth is going to directly lead to higher poverty. So London, being the fastest growing city, we know that, had about an extra 150,000 people living there by 1603. That's 10 times bigger than Norwich. We've just had our survey in Norwich. So an extra 150,000 people in the capital is not going to be easy to just merge those people all in without some sort of pressure on services and land and food. And you'll see as we go through this, that is exactly what happens and why poverty increases. And the difficult bit for this lesson, I think, what I find the trickiest is all of the examples, they sort of just merge together. They intertwine with each other, so population goes with bad harvest. So it's kind of hard sometimes to not get yourself sidetracked, and that would be okay because actually it would work really well. I think the examiners would be quite impressed with the idea of you're saying this happened, but also this made it worse, rather than just three sort of standalone paragraphs. Either way is fine, but just try and keep your head into population first. What was the population's problem? And then you can just link to bad harvest and how this worsened. Hopefully you'll see that as we go through this lesson. I'll try and talk those things through to you, and you'll see in the model answer shortly. All right, so this is one of those things where I would suggest to you as a long-term cause of poverty. So 150,000 didn't come overnight, but they did come, and as they came, more and more and more people, they slowly started putting pressure on housing, food supplies and things like that. So long-term cause of poverty for me would be population growth. So we can just spend a little bit of time now looking at this graph just to show you the rise in population. You've got your fact. You can say 35% or around 40% increase. You can say 150,000 new people in London. They're the facts the examiners will expect to see. But by the little image on the right, you can see, and I think it'd be a good idea when I finish talking about this for you to just pause and go and draw this little diagram or set this up somehow similarly in your book or wherever you're doing your notes. So if we start at the top, we can quite clearly see more people. And there's 4 arrows that come off that of how that has impacted or does impact on poverty. So it goes without saying, it's really obvious, isn't it? There's more people, that means there's more mouths to feed. So with that, the price of food goes up because it's supply and demand, isn't it? If there's not enough food to go around, then the price of it goes up. That we know. So that is what happens, and we'll talk about that as well later with inflation. Obviously, if there's more people, there's going to be more need for land for people to live on. Obviously, again, that causes problems because there's only so much land in the country. Some of the landlords do some things that you might describe as a bit harsh. They would say that they're just trying to look out for themselves. Altogether, though, that then puts pressure on cost of rent, making more people homeless because they can't afford the rent. More people, again, have a demand for cloth, for clothes, obviously. That then puts pressure on the wool trade. The price of wool then goes up, but of course, you're going to see shortly that jobs are going to go, which means they've got less money. So that's what I'm trying to say to you. This whole topic links together nicely, but also can be a bit confusing at times. And then lastly, more people means there's an increase in labour supply. More people, less jobs. Okay. As a result, wages will go down. This is going to be made worse by sheep farming, which is one of our features we'll talk about very, very shortly. So if there's more people wanting jobs and the bosses have got 5 or 10 people for one job, they will say, well, I'll lower the wages. And you're going to be desperate enough, aren't you, to take the wage, because any wage is better than no wage, being a vagabond or an itinerant. So that then they start undercutting each other, and that drove wages down. That's harsh, but that is the economies of society, really. But of course, if your wages are going down, but your food and your clothes and your rent is going up, you can see the problem. So already I feel like there's quite a nice amount of detail in the first couple of pages of this lesson where you can talk about population and its impact on the rise of poverty. So as I've said at the start, maybe just pause the video a little bit now, get your head around what you can see on the screen, try and organise your notes in the context of this being a paragraph on how population has led to poverty. Okay, so food is being the next one. Now, again, it links really nicely into poverty, but the information that we're thinking about here is that food, of course, is grown in the countryside. The farmers then take their food to the towns and cities to sell in the markets. So if there's loads of food, then there's loads of money, or certainly money enough. So we've got things like subsistence farmers. These are generally for all farmers. who are tenant farmers who rent the land off the landowners, or the yeoman farmers, they would make just enough to feed their family and just enough maybe to make a little bit of money in the markets. That's the majority of people, which is why people are so poor. They just have just enough. So as the demand for food goes up, particularly when we look at bad harvest, which means the crops don't grow, so there's less food, and because of the majority of the population wanting to be, well, everyone wants to be fed, don't they? That puts the price up. Everything that could possibly go wrong at certain points of this Elizabethan era does go wrong sometimes, leading to these really, really harsh conditions. All right, so that is a little aside. Possibly you could put this information into a paragraph in population as well if you want. But on your mind map, just make sure you've got that little bullet point underneath your food. All right, now this is definitely a short-term cause of poverty, isn't it? Because the bad harvest, or whatever it is that's meant the food didn't grow, has an immediate impact. Today it would be an immediate impact in the supermarket shelves. Back then it would be an immediate impact in the markets. And we know, don't we, that wheat for their bread, 80% of their income goes on a loaf or some bread. This is the situation that we're in. So the minute that there's no bread, never mind 80%, they just won't be able to afford it at all, which obviously is going to lead to poverty. All right, so we've mentioned bad harvest quite a lot. So let's break that down now. Get your bullet points and your notes into your little mind map regarding bad harvests. This goes without saying. Now, the first time we talked about bad harvest was when we talked about Elizabeth inheriting a bit of a difficult time from her sister Mary right at the beginning, way back at the start of the course. She's inherited £300,000 of debt, mostly from the war with France, but also a particularly bad harvest in the years before Elizabeth became queen, which has a knock-on effect to poverty. We talked, didn't we, about how Elizabeth raised taxes for this and did some really difficult things, stopped spending public money on public spending. Examples could be, I don't know, buildings, churches, services, whatever it might be, to try and save some money. Now, we want a good harvest, and remember in 1558 when she becomes queen, we do get a good harvest and the propaganda goes mad. This is because God wants Elizabeth on the throne. But throughout the next 40 odd years, there are some really difficult times with bad harvests. And the bad harvests are going to lead to the inflation, which again is another bullet point as to why poverty and the rise of vagabonds takes place. So these harvests were particularly bad in the 1550s, the 60s and the 70s. So if you've got 3 decades where you've got 2 or 3 years of bad harvests, and the increase in population just worsened things, just made things worse. Things were already bad, but then this bad harvest made that worse. Then you've got landowners doing some, I don't know, I would describe as cruel things with their land. You might disagree as we go through this later, but it is their land, I suppose. But all of it together becomes really, really, really difficult. So there's not enough food to go around anyway. Bread and grain becomes the staple diet of most people. Similar in the Germany, of course, remember under the Nazis, where rye bread and all luxuries essentially went away, didn't they? We've got the same kind of situation here. So the staple diet for these people would be bread and grain. And of course, we need the harvest to be good, to have bread and grain. I don't know if what you're seeing is worse here. You might be starting to think a little bit about this as a 16 marker. Let's do that actually. Let's think about this as a 16 marker. If it says to you population growth was the most important reason for poverty growing, then you could say actually the harvests are more important than the population growth, because even with a larger population, if the harvests were good, we'd have been able to feed them. So those kinds of language, analytical languages, that's what you need to be doing in an essay like that. Hopefully that makes sense to you, just to think about it a little bit like that as we go. So for me, at this point, I might say quite confidently that the harvests were more important than the population growth. And the reason being, as we've just said, even with a large population, if we had good harvests, we could feed them. So that to me is a good, quite clear, nice little bit of analysis. All right, so the bad harvest, of course, similarly to the food supply, is a short-term cause. If the harvest's bad, almost straight away, within days or weeks of it not being farmed and then taken to the markets, you have a cause of poverty and a lack of food. So now we get to a little bit more of a tricky technical example. Now we've talked loads about hyperinflation in the Germany course. We've talked loads about the economy generally in other areas. But inflation in this case, not hyperinflation, because hyperinflation was, remember, things were worth billions and billions and billions for an egg. This is just bad. Now, we are living in our country, and we have been for the last 5-10 years maybe, of inflation being a problem. You can't help but have noticed it. Certainly your parents, carers and people at home, they will have noticed the inflation impact on their wages. So inflation is dead simple really, is that the price of things goes up. So the example everybody seems to use in our country is the price of a Freddo bar used to be 5p, is now 30p. But you can tell yourself, just in the last couple of years, maybe cost of a bus ticket has gone up, maybe things you used to buy in the shops are more expensive now. So inflation is not good. You need your wages to keep up with inflation, otherwise the value of the money in your pocket becomes less. So with all that said, that's very much an economics lesson. We're going to try and keep it as simple as we can, but it's hard to get away from the fact that inflation is also a cause of poverty, because as I've said, that money in your pocket is now worth a whole lot less, so you can buy less, even if there was food to buy in the first place. So low wages is what leads to poverty. We've talked a little bit about this, people undercutting people who are quite willing to take a job for less pay, which means you've lost your job, or you can't get that job, you've got to go on looking for somewhere else to work. Of course, less money in your pocket, you can't buy things. That just goes without saying. Sometimes wages are kept low because of inflation though, and that's nothing to do with you or not even your fault. So wages don't rise as fast as prices. That's the simplest way to make you understand inflation, that everything else is going up in price but your wages aren't matching it. So more people then need to work because there's a population growth. Obviously, that again is adding to the problem, which means the bosses, the managers, the owners of companies or landowners, they can of course pay you a little bit less, or a lot less in some cases. So many landowners and employers cut their wages, they would say, to reduce costs. Now you might argue that that's absolutely fine. As Elizabeth would say, it's her prerogative to do these things, isn't it? And it's these landowners' prerogative to do these things. It doesn't mean it's any easier, though, for the workers and the people who are falling into poverty. But that happens today. People make redundancies, don't they, in their businesses. They cut jobs, they cut costs. And often that means, doesn't it, someone loses their job. So we can definitely relate this course, this topic, to real life. And again, I would suggest that this to you would be a long-term cause of poverty. It's slow in the process of people applying for jobs and willing to take lower wages, but I don't think it's something that happens overnight. I say long term doesn't necessarily mean years, but it's not something that happens really dead quick overnight. All right, so then we move on to another little bit of an issue in your mind map, or however you're doing this, a little subtitle for land. Again, it links quite easily to population. The more people there is in the country, the more they need land to live on, but also to work on. So as the population grows, so does the demand for land, meaning the landowners can now charge higher rents, what we call entry fees. So new tenancies also go up. So when you guys are a little bit older, you're going to get your first flat or somewhere you're going to live, you're going to rent. The rent might be quite high. It is at the moment, isn't it? You know, when we talk about rent in London, people know, don't they, the extreme cost to rent in London, which obviously prices a lot of people out, which is why they can't live in London and they have to move to live somewhere a little bit cheaper. Up north is always a little bit cheaper than it is to live down south. So that's another nice little link from real life into this course that you could absolutely understand in our way of life in today. So obviously the landowners, you could say, are greedy. That's an argument, just like it is today, but they're seeing an opportunity to make more money. So where do you draw the line? Do you make the landowners, or the people who rent, your landlords, do you make them have a maximum rent? Well, that's not really fair, is it? They'd argue. As it is, lots of Elizabeth's, nobles and MPs and these important people, the gentry, they are the landowners. So I don't know if Elizabeth is particularly going to upset them by limiting how much they can charge for rent. It seems to be a human instinct, doesn't it, to make as much money as possible. I feel like there's definitely an argument for some greed here, but it's capitalism, I suppose, in its earliest of forms, that demand and supply, that is how it is. People want to rent, people will pay, and they'll find it, and they'll sacrifice. They'll go without holidays to live in a certain place, maybe because there's more jobs there or more work there. Hence probably why London's so expensive, because of the opportunities to work. Whereas if you come and live in a little countryside village somewhere, Perhaps it's a bit cheaper because there isn't as many opportunities to make money. I don't know. All of these things are the economics of modern Britain, but directly we can link it back there. Just to try and I'm trying to basically help you understand what was going on back then as well, with some relative connections to today. So those who cannot afford these new rents, so let's just say you've been living on this particular landowner's land for years, you're good friends perhaps, I don't know, maybe probably not friends with them because they're higher up than you, but all of a sudden they come knocking on the door and they say, right, the cost has gone up, your rent has gone up, I need to charge you now 20% more, and you're like, well, hang on a minute, I really can't afford that, there's no way I can afford that, my wages have gone down, I've just found a new job, or whatever it's happened. Well, the landlord's going to say to you, that's tough, because I have got 3 or 4 people here who are willing to pay that, so pack your stuff and move on. And they are now in poverty, aren't they? They're now homeless, vagabonds or itinerants, running around the villages and the countryside or wherever they live, trying to find somewhere else to live. But of course, they then face the same problem in the next village, that rents have gone up there too. Hopefully, this is quite self-explanatory as we're talking through it and as you're listening. Just remember, as I said at the start of this though, if it's a little bit too quick, just pause it or re-listen again to the last couple of minutes, just to make sure before we move on that you have understood the sort of context that we're trying to describe. So again, you could argue this is population growth. I feel like it probably is more directly linked to population than, I don't know, bad harvest, but clearly the land does grow food. So we'll see that as well in a sec, how the land is going to be used otherwise. So long term, definitely long term, you don't basically get kicked off your land overnight. The growth of the population is quite slow, so therefore is the demand for the land. But eventually, when you're getting close to your 100, 150,000 extra people in London, then of course you can see there's going to be some problems. All right, so speaking of the land, not in the sense of rent, but in the sense of what it's used for, food, there was a thing called enclosures, okay? A little bit tricky, a little bit technical. Those of you who are agriculturally minded, perhaps, you know, our school is in Norfolk, which is a very agricultural place, so maybe you have got some understanding of how this works. For anybody else watching this, it's a little bit complicated. So enclosure is where you essentially enclose the land, okay? So you put a hedge around the land. As you can see by the image on the screen, all of this land has been enclosed so that it is used for specific things. You can see that when you're on an aeroplane looking down, you can see that most of England is enclosed, owned by landlords or different farmers or whatever it might be. Now, the important thing to understand is before enclosures, more common was that the land you're looking at on the screen right now would not have had those hedge fences. It would have been what's called common land, or certainly lots of it would have been common land, meaning that people, poor people, could do a little bit of farming on there, just enough to maybe get enough food for their own family, maybe make enough to take down to the marketplace, just enough. It was called the common land. So they have been replaced with this hedge enclosure, meaning that you are now no longer able to grow food on that piece of land. It's not common, it's been taken back by the landlord. So there's another example of why we've got less food. Less food, obviously inflation, obviously poverty. So your job really in this topic is to try and understand how everything leads to poverty. Okay, even worse, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail shortly, is some of the landlords in England at the time, they kicked off the farmers, enclosed the land, and they put sheep on the land. We know the wool trade is really, really important. We know that. It's about 90% of our exports at the time. So to put sheep on the land means you've got less land to farm on, which again, there's more lost jobs and even more unemployment. Remember that wool is valuable, so I can see why a landlord might put sheep on there. You don't have to pay sheep wages, I suppose. All you have to do is feed them. So if you're thinking about your own profits and your own wealth, that would be something that we'll look at in a bit, but definitely would lead to them kicking you off their land. So there is even less land for you to live on, making rent higher, and even less land for you to grow food on, again, making less food, making the prices go up. You can see how it all happens, and you could argue, I feel like you could argue that it's always the rich people's fault, the landowners' fault, if they just didn't do these things, but the market generally dictates what happens. Even today, what people are willing to pay, what people can afford, the cost of things are generally dictated to by the market. Maybe people could do different things, maybe, but if you have invested in a house or loads of properties, you want to make money off it, don't you? Okay, so overall then, the enclosure is going to add to the problem. It's going to make the problem even worse. And the landlords and the landowners, they're quite willing to do this. Now, although it's bad and although we're talking about it, in the end, only about 3% of the land was enclosed by the end of Elizabeth's reign. But where it did happen, it definitely led to poverty, definitely led to some really severe problems. All right, so what has happened to these labourers and what did they become? We've mentioned it already in the bit, but just to get your head around a specific question on this, they obviously become unemployed. They become vagabonds or itinerants running around looking for work. The worst thing that could happen is you lose your job and your house. And if you've got a family, you can just see how this is going to be absolutely extreme. All right, so this image or these two images just give you another little idea. You don't need to spend a long time on it, just to show you what happens before and after enclosure. You can see on the first image, open fields, loads of people can be out there growing some food, growing some crops, working a bit of the land. You know, they rent the land, they're tenant farmers. That means that they pay rent to a landlord. When you look at after enclosure, you can see each bit of land has been given to a specific person. They use their land for whatever they want, but ultimately what it means is you, as a common farmer, peasant, whatever, you can't use it. Just another little visual of what we've talked about to see if that helps. You can see why they did it, but it certainly made things a whole lot worse with people losing their jobs, losing their homes, all because the landlords wanted to do something different with their land. And I think that's the key bit, isn't it? Like we're saying, it's their land. All right, so let's have a little thought about these sheep. Okay, so sheep farming and enclosures. We've done enclosures. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense to you. But let's consider the sheep farming as a thing. So many farmers who are seeing the problems with bad harvest and things like that, they're starting to think to themselves, what can we do to make some more profit? So they decided to switch to different methods of agriculture, which we'll have a little look at shortly, or replacing agriculture farming completely with sheep instead. Okay, so the poverty is obviously going up because of the common land is now gone. Hopefully, by now, we understand that. Especially if you are replacing the common land that was used for farming with sheep. Less food is being grown. All of those problems then come with inflation and the cost of things. But obviously, you've got less jobs, even less jobs. The sheep are having the time of their lives, aren't they, on the fields, eating away, being fed. And some of these landowners, they also use some of their land to grow food to feed the sheep. So not food to feed the people, especially in a time of poverty and crisis. Now that I suppose you could argue is just cruel and just nasty. But if they're making a lot of money from wool, which of course they are, the wool trade is everything, isn't it really? I don't know, I don't suppose they cared about these poor people. Perhaps as the course goes on, as the Elizabethan reign goes on, there is clearly examples that they do seem to want to deal with the problem that arguably they're causing being the nobility. All right, so again, it's obvious, isn't it? If you put sheep on a field, it's a whole lot easier for the landlord. Don't have to pay wages, just have to feed them. It's just easier for them, but it means less jobs for the humans. All right, and as we've said, some of this land was even grown just to feed the sheep, not feed the people, which to me is really, really bad. Just cruel. But this is the world that we're in, especially in a time where poor people aren't particularly cared for as they are today. All right, so sheep farming and enclosures is probably a long-term thing, isn't it? It didn't all happen overnight, just some landowners decided, and as time went on, when they were seeing the problems of the harvest and things like that, it was just easier, wasn't it, to have sheep on a field rather than deal with the bad harvest and the crops and things like that. So long-term cause of poverty. So now we have this rise of the itinerant, okay? So remember they're people who are walking around looking for work, okay? After the landlords put their rent up, many farmers had to move to the towns and the cities, very similar to the Industrial Revolution. If you remember when they moved from the countryside because there was no work and the factories and all the rest of it in the medicine course, they go to the cities to find work because there is no work in the countryside anymore, or certainly not enough work to sustain them, so they go and they live in these horrible conditions working in factories and mills. This is quite similar. So they are off to the towns and the cities to try and find work. Obviously that means there's more and more people looking for jobs in these towns and cities, meaning higher unemployment. And as we've seen in London with 150,000 new people in the city, a lot of them will have come from the countrysides and the towns. and lots of them will have come from Europe as well to try and get a share of the wealth that is in London. Ironic that it's going to the wealthy and not the poor. All right, so the rise of the itinerants is a long-term thing, again, only because it didn't happen overnight. It happened over weeks and months, maybe a couple of years, but definitely there's an impact there, isn't there? If they're walking around the country looking for work, then they're going to be adding to the unemployed list when they get to the cities and the towns. They've obviously exhausted the idea. So if it was around where our school is, imagine them walking around from Terrington to Clenchwarton, maybe they're gone to Tilney All Saints. They're just walking around, but of course there's loads of them just walking around looking for work. And the people who are going to offer the work, if there is any, they're going to offer it to the person who's willing to accept the lowest wages. And again, that links back to that bit we talked about earlier. So this little cartoon gives you a bit of an idea of this situation, the scene that you might see. So there's a guy here talking to another fella. He's saying, we've had to leave our home because he's just lost his job. He couldn't pay the rent. The landlord decided to put sheep on the land and there's just no jobs. That is him summarising what we've talked about so far. There is an economic recession that's caused by the conflict with Spain. So the price of goods have gone up, or the making of goods. There's a recession, the economy is struggling. We know that the issue with Spain is going to get worse. In fact, if you're watching this as a revision video, then you know already that the war with Spain is going to be a massive impact on the economy at home. So that's damaged trade. Most of our trade goes through Antwerp, remember, which of course is controlled by the Spanish in the Netherlands. So therefore businesses are struggling, and then again there are no jobs. So he meets his mate, and his mate's saying there, oh, there might be work in the towns, shall we go there? Off they go. And he's got his little boy with him as well, his little kid. And he says, I have to live in a shack outside the city. If I can't earn money by working, I'll have to beg for food or steal it. That is what happens, isn't it? Why generally crime is related to poverty. Most often than not, people who commit crimes are just desperate for food or whatever it might be. Of course, some people commit crimes are just, not good. But there's usually a reason, especially if it's like to feed your kids or something. But if you're the one being robbed, then obviously it doesn't feel good at all. So this little cartoon really does just sum up kind of what we've said so far all together. All right. So why did the landowners do this? This is a little bit more technical now. So we'll take our time just to step back and try and see it from their perspective. It's easy to get angry. It's easy to get a little bit upset and think, well, why are you doing these things, causing all this poverty and all this pain? There's kids on the streets hungry, whatever it might be. So we'll see what it was like before they enclosed the land and what's happened afterwards. And you can decide yourself if you can understand why they did these things. So firstly, before the land was enclosed, many people worked the land. There was no coordinated and effective way of growing crops or looking after the animals. Just everyone's having a bit of land here, there and everywhere. So it probably is a little bit chaotic. Probably a few little arguments after the drink down the pub. Oh, you're in my land, or you've taken my crops, or whatever it might be. So afterwards, it's quite clear to see that the farmers wanted to do more arable farming. So, growing crops on the land to take advantage of the high food prices. So clearly they want the land for that. So they're going to take control so they can control rather than it being so chaotic. Enclosing the land makes it easier to do that because they can drain the land and they can use fertilizers so the crops can be grown there. But when it's chaos and everyone's got a bit of it, it's much harder to do that, isn't it? So that's one reason why they enclosed, and I feel like that's quite a fair justification for why they did it. Obviously, why they did it is irrelevant when we know that it causes some severe problems. So then also, before enclosure, the land was left fallow. So those of you that are interested in agriculture, basically what that means is when you have your crops one year, you have to leave that field empty the year after so it can recover and get all its nutrients and stuff back. That means you've got a big old piece of land that has nothing happening on it, especially when people are hungry. That's a waste, isn't it? So after enclosure, the farmers, the landlords if you like, they can grow crops one year, and then the year after they can use it for animals. Animals with their waste and their poo, they can fertilize the land, and then the next year it can go back to crops and so on. So you've got this sort of system that keeps that land generally useful or worth something, and obviously the only way to do that is to enclose it so you can have certain fields doing certain things. This is generally what happens in the agricultural revolution, which improves farming no end, and in the end improves the amount of food that we produce. But at the time, it also means less land for people to grow food on. The common land is gone. So whilst we can see the issue with it, we can also see possibly the reason why the landowners did it. And then finally, the animals grazed, so ate the grass, everywhere and anywhere. Livestock are breathing with everyone. Well, not everyone, that sounds a bit random, but there's loads of calves and foals and all sorts just breathing willy-nilly because they're free to roam. After enclosure, they're obviously kept within fields, and they would be allowed to breed when the farmer or the landlord wants them to. This allows you to start thinking about the idea of breeding your best male with your best female and just improving your stock, really, which we know, don't we, that this is something that goes on in the future when it comes to breeding anything, animals, cats, dogs, horses. You are essentially breeding your best. If they're all in a field together, you can keep the boys in one field, the females in another field, and you can introduce the males and females to each other when you want, rather than the free-for-all that was happening before enclosure. So just to take a little bit of a step back here, this is probably less important in the grand scheme of the topic and the question of why did poverty increase, but it's just interesting just to try and give you the perspective from the landowners why they did the things that they did. I think it's clear to see that there's definitely a logic there, and there's not necessarily, I don't think, a hatred of poor people. Wasn't their motivation to make people poor, but they were certainly thinking about being more effective use of their land. So that gives you a little bit of an insight, really, just to the agricultural side of things. Okay, so the countryside as a whole, we've said, haven't we, that that's where all the food is grown. The towns and cities are where we sell things. So in the countryside, we've mentioned that there's some better techniques being used. They're being developed, and obviously these ideas are spreading from countryside, from farm to farm to farm, because of the printing press. We've mentioned the better animal control and the breeding, and a mix of arable and animal farming becomes common. So it's changed the whole entire landscape, really, sometimes possibly through luck, sometimes through decisions made because of the bad harvest, whatever it is. But as we get through this Elizabethan period, farming will never be the same again, agriculture will never be the same again, but there's a lot of pain that comes with that as we start to advance and move forward with technology. All right, so the enclosures continued. More and more common land was enclosed, leading to even more poor, and of course with that comes a lot of anger. So with that said, we've come to the point where we can just step back a little bit. Hopefully your mind map is well and truly detailed of all of the reasons what's led to poverty and how they've linked. So just have a little pause, just step back, practice this interpretation question again. Remember, it's paper 3, so for us, the Germany paper. What is the view of interpretation 1 in relation to the cause of unrest in Elizabethan England? And how do you know? I can tell this because it says, and then do you agree? So go and answer that. Write a couple of sentences and a little bit of a mini paragraph perhaps on if you agree with this or not. And then when you're ready, come back and we'll move on. Alright, so I think that it's quite clear that this interpretation is essentially saying that the reason for the unrest in England is because of the rise of poverty. Really, he's saying only second to religion, and I do agree with that. You can pick a sentence. It says, I can tell this because it says the gradual loss of land to the working man and his family may fairly be described as the second greatest single cause. It's equally worrying, the rise of homelessness, begging and things like that. It all comes down, doesn't it, to this growing population or whatever. So quite a nice little practice of an interpretation. Hopefully you agreed with what I've said there. It's basically saying that this is what is causing the trouble. The farming, the enclosures, the economy. They're saying that's the biggest cause before religion is. All right. Now, obviously, if this was the paper 3, you'd have another interpretation that would be suggesting that perhaps religion was the biggest cause of the tension. So, Catholic, Protestant stuff. Just nice to be thinking about those things, particularly if you're watching this video as a revision video, keeping in mind that you also have to do that paper 3 as well. All right. So if we put all of this together, everything that we've talked about in this first bit of the lesson together, into a washing machine as a bit of an analogy, loads of colours mixing together, out you're going to come are basically a big mess of colours. So on the screen you can see all the things we've talked about that would lead to poverty. We need to think about this in sense of an exam. All right, so that's what's led to the poverty, and these are the questions that you might be asked on this topic. So the 12 marker would be a lot easier because you have free choice, any 3. Explain why poverty increased between 1558 and 1588, and population growth was the main reason. So the 16 marker, it gives you that statement. Remember, the difference is you've got 3 paragraphs in the 12 marker, no intro, no conclusion. In the 16 marker, you do have your intro, which is your judgment, whether you agree with that or not and how far. And if you don't agree, then that's where you say what you do think is the biggest thing to blame. How far do you agree? I don't know. I don't. I think possibly bad harvest and enclosures is probably more important, but equally it doesn't matter. It's up to you to decide, but quite a nice 16 marker as they go, even though the topic is quite technical and quite difficult. So here on the screen you're going to see 3 paragraphs that could be a decent answer to explain why poverty increased. Paragraph 1, we're going to go with the point hopefully is easy to see. One reason why poverty increased in Elizabethan England was the rising population. So you can pause the video now and you can have a read through that paragraph yourself. Maybe perhaps write it, have a go at writing it in time conditions, but what might be more useful is if you read the next 3 paragraphs as they come in this lesson and then go away and try and do it yourself off memory. That would be more useful, or perhaps use these 3 paragraphs that you read through now and then go away and do the 16 marker. So in essence the 3 paragraphs may stay the same, but within the paragraphs you're then a lot more analytical. You're saying why one is more important than the other. If you do think that population is the biggest, then you're obviously saying why population growth is more important than the others. But maybe that would be a better use, because you've got a 12 marker here, and then the night before your Elizabeth exam, as always with these model answers that you've got in your books or on Google Classroom or on these online videos, just get your head around the topics so that if you get asked this question, you've got a bit of an idea on how to do it. So go away, have a little read of this paragraph. When you're ready, unpause the video and then go on to paragraph 2. And then paragraph 3. Okay, so paragraph 2, when you're ready, another reason for the rise in poverty was the harvest. So this paragraph is now going to be about the harvests. Pause the video, have a little read of this, do what you need to do with it, either write it or maybe add some notes to it yourself, or read it and perhaps make a paragraph if it was a 16 marker. So now you'd be saying why the harvests were more or less important than the population growth, but essentially the gist of the paragraph stays the same. The facts and the figures stay the same. Okay, so pause the video and then when you're ready, come back to paragraph 3. Alright, so paragraph 3 in this question, I have written a final reason poverty was inflation. So this paragraph is going to be about inflation, which can include wages, costs of food, whatever, 80% on spending on bread. This is what we said in the start of this lesson. They all do kind of link together a little bit, don't they, each paragraph, which makes this 12 marker much easier, because you can keep saying as previously said, or this made what the situation that we've already mentioned, the population, even worse. So that's quite a good way to look at this question. So again, pause the video, do what you want with this paragraph. Ideally, if you have chosen to do the 16 marker as we go, just add this information, but remember to add that bit of analysis that despite this happening, this was less important than because, etc., etc. Okay, and when you're ready, we'll go on and have a little bit of a reflection on this question as a technical thing. All right, so this question as a whole is, well, there's worse questions that they could ask us, definitely. It is a complex topic. We can see that it's a complex topic. Just make sure you can confidently discuss 3 reasons for poverty increasing. Your mind map that you've made throughout this lesson will definitely help with that, or however you've done your notes. 12 marks are easy, I think, the 3 paragraphs, but the 16 marker, as you've hopefully had a go at, is also quite straightforward. So you could easily be saying things like, if it wasn't for the population growing, then, or despite population growing, then enclosures made the situation worse because, like I said earlier in this lesson, even if the population was growing, the bad harvests meant that they couldn't feed them. If the harvests were good, then it wouldn't be such a problem because they could afford to still feed them. So that would be my argument as to why population is probably less important than the bad harvest. But that's my opinion, and that's the joy of history, isn't it? So hopefully we've had a bit of time out there from the topic, from the content of this lesson, to look at it from the perspective of an exam question, and hopefully you've had a go at the exam question, or at least read very carefully the model answer, or a good answer for that 12 mark. And I reckon probably in real life that would get maybe 10 or 11, maybe 12 on a good day. It's good enough, definitely, as a way to sort of consolidate this knowledge. All right, so now we need to think about, we've done the causes of poverty. Let's have a little think now about where this could lead us in the terms of dealing with it. As you can see on the screen there is just a little summary of the topic and some notes. Just in case you maybe missed the notes or you haven't quite got them down, this is an example of what you could have. This is available on the website in the Elizabeth section with all the lessons. And there's a little example of a 16 marker if you want to have a go at that, with the possible bullet points that you can pick. Remember, you would have to do population growth because that's the statement. So now we'll move on to how the government are going to deal with it. How do their attitudes towards the poor change? Bearing in mind it's largely some of the members of the government who put them in this position in the first place. All right, so attitudes towards the poor, a little subtitle perhaps in your notes for this, or your book, whatever you do in your notes, and we'll just go straight on to seeing what they did about it. So they introduced this thing called poor relief. Okay, we would call that probably benefits today. So it's paid for by local taxes. So people have to pay taxes for the poor. The same arguments that we would have today, for sure, definitely. Why should the rich pay for the poor? Whatever the argument is, it was a very similar argument back then. However, the Elizabethans, who are religious, remember, they believe it's a Christian duty to help the poor, especially the deserving poor. And that's what we'll talk about in a sec, where there's a definite distinction between those that are deserving poor and those that are not deserving poor. Remember, we talked in the government lesson a long time ago, the JPs are the local people. They be the ones organising the poor relief, going around collecting the poor relief. Obviously, that could face them some trouble, knocking on a door that people don't want to pay. But in the end, as you'll see shortly, they have to pay. Okay, so can you think of anything before we move on that might have made this situation, the idea of charity, a little bit harder for the Elizabethans related to Henry VIII? Maybe just pause the video and write an answer and then come back and we'll have a very quick answer to that. Okay, so obviously when Henry VIII destroys the Catholic Church or changes the Church of England to his own church and destroys the monasteries, it would have been the monasteries, wouldn't it, the monks and the nuns who did the charity, who looked after the poor. Of course, the monasteries also were used for the hospitals previously, where they cured but didn't cure. So when Henry destroys the monasteries, he essentially destroys the charity, meaning that there's less places for these people to go to when they are at rock bottom. Again, probably, and adding to the problem, really, that people have made these choices. Okay, so that's just a little aside. So let's think a little bit about what the government is going to do about this and why they're worried. Answer that question before we do move on in your book or on your notes. Why would the government be worried about the rise of poverty? We've sort of alluded to it throughout this lesson a little bit earlier on, but just have a little think to yourself, why? Why would there be a concern for the rise of poverty? Okay, so the answer to that question is really quite simple. Poor people commit crime, don't they? We've mentioned it, they're desperate. So they felt that poverty would lead to disorder and rebellion. The more and more people who are poor, think back to year 7 when we learned about the Peasants' Revolt. There's only so much poor people can take, isn't there? But there was violence. You can see in some of the images, they were living in shacks outside the towns. People were getting their heads battered in, burnt and boiled alive. It was just chaos, because these people were so desperate, so angry at society. But remember as well, in this feudal system, this hierarchy of society, everyone's got a place to the person above them. But if you're a vagabond, you're just milling around the streets of the country, moving around, you don't actually belong to anybody. You don't have a master, you don't have an employer, you don't have a landlord, so essentially you're living outside of the law, and that is the problem. Committing crime, stealing, all those things are adding to the problem. So now the government are going to do something about this. Because there is so much going on, so much poverty, it's about time, even if you could argue they caused a lot of it. Alright, so the government were right to worry, as shacks these were built tightly packed outside city walls, a real mess. As they were out of reach of the city's laws, crime and disorders rife. All towns in the country faced the same, even King's Lynn. I'd imagine these people would have built shacks outside the south gates. Just every town would have been the same. So something is going to be done about it, so let's have a little look. Let's take a step back though and have a little context cracker, just to think about what's going on earlier in this course that's going to make this whole thing worse. Alright, I'll give you some clues. 1563, that is probably really hard. I don't expect you to get it from that. But if we have the second clue, Philip II of Spain in 1563. Clue 3, something involving the Netherlands. And then clue 4, something to do with English merchants. What do you think we've talked about earlier on in the course that might be making this economic situation even worse? Alright, so I wonder if you got the answer to this. The answer is, of course, that trade embargo. Remember, Philip had the trade embargo on English cloth because Elizabeth was essentially helping out the Dutch Protestants. That lasted a year, adding to the inflation. We can't sell our stuff because they are not buying it. We can't go to Antwerp. So that's just a nice little thing to step back on and see how, as we go through this course, this topic, things were always happening. And as you know, particularly if you're watching this from a revision point of view, the war with Spain in the 1580s, that is clearly going to impact our ability to trade, isn't it? All right, so let's move on a little bit to see this idea of the impotent poor, the deserving poor. So they would be people who are too sick to work. Perhaps they've been injured in a battle or they're just too old. So they are impotent, but they are deserving poor. There's a definite distinction now, but then of course we have the able-bodied or idle poor. You'd be expected to use those terms, impotent or able-bodied, but if it's easier, just say deserving and undeserving. So the distinction really of the undeserving is that you can work, but you're choosing not to work. Again, we could have these arguments today, couldn't we, in modern Britain? But the undeserving poor or the idle poor were punished very, very harshly. They were whipped, imprisoned. If they were consistently being caught, they would eventually even be killed. So this is where it gets a little bit sad. These people are being killed, they're being punished, they're being whipped, but a lot of them have found themselves as vagabonds through no fault of their own because of everything else we've talked about in this lesson. So that seems to me a little bit harsh. The government, though, are clearly going to think about the poor. They're going to change attitudes slightly. So the able-bodied poor has increased during the trade embargo we've just talked about, but also with 68 to 73, 86 to 88. When times are tough, usually to do with the Netherlands and Spain, really, there's a rise in able-bodied poor through no fault of their own, and of course there's going to be a rise in the punishments as well, because that's just how it is. But remember, poor people are dangerous for society's norms and expectations. Okay, so when trade is bad, especially during the cloth trade, the number of able-bodied increase. We've mentioned that just to summarise because it's important. Especially noticeable in the towns because there's so many of them moving to the towns from the countryside looking for work. The more of them that are there, obviously the less chance they're going to get some work because people will undercut their wages. People who've lost their livelihoods in the rural areas, they're also moving to the towns. And then the cloth trade, as we've mentioned previously, just a minute ago, these decades where there was some severe impact on the cloth trade, which is 90% of our exports. So if you are selling wool, or even if you are a sheep farmer, your income, your wealth is being impacted, especially in those years there. Okay, so generally speaking, that's around the Netherlands, the Dutch revolt, but also in the 80s when we go to war directly with Spain. Also, Elizabeth is going to try and advance some markets in the Americas. Again, if you're watching this as a revision video, then you'll know that we have set up some markets out there. All right, so this all relates to the wool trade really simply. If you can't sell, you can't make money, then you obviously have to perhaps think about what you're doing with your employers and making them unemployed. So the laws that were going to be passed, we're going to look at 3 laws from 63, 72 and 76. It's no surprise that they come around about the times when the economy is at its worst. Okay, so for your notes now, just essentially you're going to think about 3 laws, separate laws. What are the features of these laws? I would imagine that's how it'd be asked. What's one feature of the Vagabond Act? But we'll look at it in a sec. But this is just a fun fact page really for you. You can just pause the video and have a little look if you want. Just some examples of some of the things that happened in Tudor England. So the anglers, they used a long stick to steal clothes from washing lines. The counterfeit crank, he pretended to have a fit by swallowing soap and foamed at the mouth. Obviously people ran around to try and help him. The clapperdudgeon put arsenic on their skin to make it bleed and wrap bandages around their arms and legs to make them obviously, well, they're really poorly, aren't they? But in the hope of getting some sympathy and hopefully some money. And a doxy would carry a bag where she hid things in that she'd stolen, often knitted whilst begging, and she wears a needle in her hat. So this bag is basically just full of things that she's nicked. So they're just 4 examples. There's like hundreds of examples of crime, just like there is today. But this is just a little fun fact page for you. Okay, so let's think about the laws that this government are going to pass. This is the Privy Council that you can see here. We're whipping the vagabonds, the vagrants, and we send them away. If they are found in another parish from where they initially come from, they will be sent back to where they came from and whipped even more. Again, if they were found again, they would be possibly killed. So there's local officers who are going around collecting these poor rates weekly, and given this money to the impotent poor, those deserving, okay? It's a tax, isn't it? We're paying tax to help these poor people, especially in the context of the problems that we're facing with the Dutch revolt and things like that. So these are happening generally when times are really bad, a trade embargo or a bad harvest or something, not generally as the norm. So law 1 that you want to think about, first of all, as your notes, okay, is going to be the Statute of Artificers. So in 1563, a statute is a law. This ensured that poor relief was going to be collected. Anyone who refused to pay the poor rates could be imprisoned, and officials who failed to collect it could be fined up to £20. So the JPs who refused to collect it, or anyone whose job it was to go around collecting this poor relief, 20 quid is going to wipe a lot of families out. Remember the £20 fine for being a recusant in the 70s has gone up because of the threat from the Catholics. So maybe before you move on to this one, just pause the video and do a quick features answer. So describe one feature of the Statute of Artificers, and then the detail, the supporting detail, give a bit of extra detail for that for 1 mark. So this is the first law that they did. So you can see that the government are definitely interested. They're caring, aren't they? They're trying to get this poor relief money in to help the impotent poor, the poor that are deserving more so, shall we say. All right. So this is passed in a law in Parliament. So remember, she's called Parliament 10 times in her whole reign. This will be one of the laws that she needed to pass, that she needed Parliament to do that for. Okay. Then we move on to the Vagabond Act. The aim of this act is to try and deter you from being a vagabond. But this whole lesson is very clear that most of them didn't do this by choice. They found themselves as a vagabond through lots of things that were going wrong on their behalf. So the key features of the Vagabond Act are that vagrants are to be whipped and a hole is going to be drilled through each ear. So some places you'll have one ear. If you got caught again, it would be the second ear would be drilled. And then if you were caught a third time, then you probably would be killed. And then march through the villages being whipped so everybody knew who you were. Really quite harsh and quite embarrassing and humiliating. Vagrants were also imprisoned if arrested again. So depending on where you were, where this was happening, depending on your local sort of militias and lords, lieutenants or whatever, this is generally what would happen because of the Vagabond Act. They're trying to make you not be a vagabond. It's really hard when being a vagabond is thrust upon you. So the vagrants are killed if arrested for a third time, as we've said. So again, just before we move on to getting towards the end of this lesson, have a practice of a features question, one feature of the Vagabond Act. You pick and you just write a little bit of supporting detail for it. So one feature of the Vagabond Act was it was to deter vagrancy. That's your feature, isn't it? And then the supporting detail, any one of those things, or a mixture of all three if you want. Okay. Also establishes the national poor rate, which is helping to shelter the impotent poor. Again, although it's really harsh on the vagabonds, it's also saying that there is going to be a national poor rate to help those who are deserving, the deserving poor. This is good. It's the beginning, isn't it, of a welfare state, probably. JPs are also to keep a register of the poor, so they know exactly who the poor are. That would become quite a job in certain parts of the reign. So those 3 sort of really tough times throughout the 45-year reign, the JPs are probably busier than ever because there's a lot more of them at times. So it's their job to keep a register. So you've got loads of features here that you could do. A nice little features question for the Vagabonds Act. Okay, and then finally, towns and cities were given the responsibility to find work for the able-bodied. So it becomes down to the Council of King's Lynn, if you like, or the parish, or wherever you are. It was their job to find work for those people that were deemed idle. So you can work, so you will work. They have to find them some work. So as a law goes, this is really good. With one hand, they batter you. With the other hand, they're trying to help you. There's definitely a distinction here, isn't there, between able-bodied and impotent poor. All right, so nice, easy way to end this lesson, really, are these laws. The causes of poverty are a bit more tricky, but this is quite straightforward. All right, so then the final law that she passes in 1576 is the Poor Relief Act. And this was a law that absolutely would legally distinguish the able-bodied and the impotent poor and would help the able-bodied poor find work. So just formalising a little bit the Vagabond Act from previously. So the key features of the Poor Relief Act are dead simple. The JPs will provide work for the poor. They'll give them wool or other raw materials which will allow them to make goods, products that they can then take to the markets to sell. So they are essentially being given raw materials to make something out of it. This is quite a good idea. A lot of people suggest that's what should happen today. For people on benefits, they should be given the means to perhaps maybe have their own little business or start a little job or something. It's complicated, but the feature is there, the idea is there that it is entirely possible. A second feature of the Poor Relief Act is those who refused were sent to a special prison known as a house of correction. So if those able-bodied people who refused to take the help, the raw materials or the wool, then they'd go to prison, a house of correction. And that kind of thing really carried on right into the Victorian period, where the poor were sent to horrible places if they refused to work or whatever it might be. The poor generally don't get a good deal, do they? All right, and then just an image really of these vagabonds being whipped through the streets with everyone watching. You can see it's going to be sore, it's humiliating, people being hanged in the background as well. This was really a time where you didn't want to be a vagabond when they're passing these laws, but sadly and even more frustrating, remember, as everything we've said in this lesson, a lot of them didn't have a choice, they didn't have a chance, they were just made poor, and that to me is quite sad. It's a little bit of a sad period of history looking back on people who were killed for this, but perhaps if they could work and they didn't work, I don't know, I don't advocate ever killing people, but punishments perhaps if that's what you're trying to do to make people go to work. Okay, so what was the impact of Elizabeth's poor laws? Let's draw this lesson to a bit of a close now, 'cause it's quite a long one. We did say it's a technical one that maybe you need to watch over a couple of hours perhaps, not maybe all at once. But the fact that it's all here and you can pause the video when and where you need to and re-listen makes this hopefully a little bit more useful as revision. So firstly, many things have changed for the better, but poverty is still a big problem. That's clear. All right. Conflict with Spain and the Netherlands, we know, is hitting trade really badly. That's making everything else worse, particularly if you are in the wool trade. But also, obviously, if we're at war, taxes go up and everything else. When you're already poor, we're already struggling, it just makes things a whole lot worse. As more and more people are moving to the towns and cities, vagrancy or the vagabonds, they're growing. Of course there are, because there's more of them, as did, therefore, troubles, crimes, things like that. So the most important change that you might consider in this whole story is that the government have had a slight change in attitude towards the poor. There is now a recognition that unemployment is a genuine problem. All right. Previously, they'd have ignored them, killed them, battered them, moved them on, whatever it was they did. But the government has now accepted that it's a genuine problem that needs to be dealt with. Hence the laws that we've just talked about. Okay, so providing the poor with these raw materials to make things to sell becomes law. This gives the poor some independence, gives them their dignity back. Definitely a positive experience. Ipswich, for example, has established a school for poor children and a hospital for those who are sick. So certain places, obviously, if the rich decide to open up schools or hospitals, that's what we're relying on now, aren't we? The charity hospitals, if you remember from the medicine course. People can do that. Rich people can do that if they feel a need or a calling. So attitudes are changing, and then in some London parishes, some special help was provided for abandoned babies, the old and the sick. So these are nice examples of how perhaps attitudes are slightly changing. And this maybe goes some way to begin this idea of a welfare state that's going to come very, very soon in the future. So again, you're going to see 4 graphs now, just to summarise this whole topic. Just answer in your book or your notes or wherever you're doing it what you can learn. So see them as sources of information. What can you learn? What can you work out? What can you infer from these sources? And make sure you use something specific from the graph in your answer. Pause the video while you're doing that, and when you come back, move on to the next 2. Okay, so the next 2, when you're ready, are similar. Just again, pause the video. What can you work out? What can you see? This is really quite similar to the economy in the Nazi Germany course. You know, the how did Hitler solve the problem of the economy with the RAD, the DAF, invisible unemployment, the food they could eat. A really similar kind of activity, really, but just to show you that there are lots of similarities throughout all of the time periods. That's partly what they say, don't they? We learn from history that we sometimes don't learn from history. But in this case, in the Elizabethan course, a lot of this was just, it happened to them rather than because of them. So when you're happy with these 2 sources, you've picked out some bits, continue the video. All right, so this again is a little summary of what we've talked about in this lesson. There's a lot of information at you, I understand that, it's a long video, but this little image will hopefully tie you down to some basics that in an exam question you could obviously add on to that too. So we can see, can't we, the impact that some communities were sympathetic, Ipswich for example, and others were less sympathetic, shall we say. It's cheaper to give them money and send them away than to deal with them. That's what some places. So it's a mixed bag. The impact is good in some places, not so good in other places. In some towns, the vagabonds were whipped, sent back to where they were born, killed, holes in their ears. Also, that most people now recognise that unemployment wasn't usually because someone was lazy. That expectation now, the understanding now that it's been done to them for a variety of reasons: poverty, population, enclosures, everything we've said today. So giving them a way to make things better for them is an acknowledgement of that, certainly, and I feel like a really good thing. And then, as we've said, some towns offer a little extra help. Ipswich is our good example, and some parts of London offering to help abandon babies, the old and the sick. So overall, you might decide that things have got better or things have not got better, but there are at least some positives. I don't know, possibly the very, very worst 16 marker they could definitely ask is asking you that. Did attitudes improve for the better? I don't know. That's a hard one, that really. I would hopefully think it would be something more about the causes of poverty rather than this bit. All right, so hopefully with this lesson now coming to an end, you can understand that it's big. It's a big topic. It's complicated. It's technical, but just take it for what it is. Think about the model answers that you've seen in this online lesson. Just try to understand the causes of poverty. This diagram here would be a good little revision exercise for you to do, just to explain how each of them have led to the next problem. Ideally not necessarily now as you've just watched this video, but come back to this maybe in a couple of weeks or before your exam. Just do this task and then add anything else on there as well, any other bits and bobs that you know of or you can think of either before revision and then after revision, see if you can add to it. But this is basically where your head needs to be for this topic. How did all of these things lead to a rise in poverty? With a little summary from our textbook, just for you to have a little go at some checkpoints if you want, and a little overview. And overall, a reminder again that all lessons are available on our website at stchistory.com, along with the resources that would accompany this lesson. You can download the documents and things to write on as well, or put them into your Google Doc or whatever, as well as Google Classroom. You'll have some stuff on there. So once again, thank you for staying for this lesson. It was a long one and a tricky one, but hopefully this video has helped. If you need anything or you have any questions, obviously just let your teacher know. Okay, once again though, thank you very much, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.